Canada, Mexico, and the United States form one of the world's largest free trade zones, with 500 million people and a combined gross domestic product of more than 25 trillion US dollars. So when the leaders of those countries gather, as they did for the North American Leader Summit this week, it matters. Louise Blais served as Canada's ambassador to the UN and was formerly posted in the US as a Consul General for Canada. She is now Special Advisor to the Business Council of Canada and was at this week's summit and joins us now from Sarasota, Florida, for some perspective on what was accomplished. Welcome to the program.
Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
As we mentioned, very busy week for you, and I want to take a step back before we look at sort of the accomplishments and what was sort of discussed. What were some of the political crises or global events that sort of shaped and influenced the topics that were discussed at this year's summit?
Well, the past year has been enormously disruptive, obviously, for the North America and our supply chain in particular. The war in Ukraine, the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, as well as, just as we were just coming out of the pandemic. That was a second shock that just hit us broadside. So going into this summit, I think the leaders were really very much thinking about economic security.
All right, let's talk about, from the Canadian perspective, what were Trudeau's main objectives going into this summit? Because there was a lot of conversation that, hey, this was really going to be a summit about Mexico. The Americans had a lot of stuff that they wanted to cover, and potentially Canada's sort of agenda was going to be overshadowed.
Actually, while I was personally worried about that going into the summit, I was very pleased to see that a lot of work had gone on in advance of the summit. Diplomats from all three countries worked very, very hard in ironing out issues and putting forward a framework for a more North American approach to our economic challenges. So actually, I think it was a very successful summit for Canada. The other aspect that was really brand new this time is that for the very, very first time, there was a business component to the summit. So the day before the trilateral, we had delegations from all three countries meeting with each other to come up with solutions to shared challenges, but also having access to the leaders to share with them our concerns from the business community, but also what we think would be paths to consider moving forward.
All right, we'll definitely get to some of those business conversations as well. I want to talk about some wins. There was a few things that had floated around in terms of biggest achievements for Canada. What would you say are the biggest achievements for Canada that came out of the talk so far?
Sometimes people say these summits are not very helpful or there's just it's just pro forma. That's actually quite not true, because leading on to the summit, what we saw is a willingness on the part of the Americans to help solve some of our outstanding issues. And here I'm referring to Nexus. I don't think it's an accident that we were able to announce a workaround to the Nexus impasse. And I think that's enormously positive. I think we heard that the Americans were asking Canada to lean in even further in Haiti. Look, this is a positive thing. It does not matter in the end what Canada does decide to do. The fact that the United States is looking to Canada to help it solve problems, I think, is a very positive development. So I do think that Prime Minister Trudeau carved quite a bit of profile for himself. And this was no easy feat, given that leading the week before the summit, we had the arrest of the cartel issues and the Americans very, very much concerned with the border, the president going to the border on his way to the summit. At the end of the day, once they were the three of them together, they really spoke trilaterally and they projected themselves into the future. So that was very good to see for Canada.
I want to follow up actually on Nexus in Haiti. I want to start with the first. Why? There was this backlog back in October of over 300,000 applications. They have since come down. I think they've cut that down by 100,000 or so. There's some progress on there. But why was this breakthrough significant for Canada regarding Nexus?
Well, with the Nexus program, really, Canada is by far the biggest user. it really makes a huge difference for our business leaders to be able to move more easily through the border. Time is money. So we have focused for a very, very long time on making the border more efficient for goods. But at the same time, now a lot of the world's economy is based on services. So you really do have a lot of back and forth on the border, and then being able to clear more efficiently our busy airports, I think it was a priority for Canada. And we had an enormous backlog. The Americans coming out of the pandemic were doubling down on their requirement that their border agents be protected, have immunities while they were screening Canadians. So I think that, and they did try to leverage our desire to get this solved so that they could get that immunity protection. In the end, I think the workaround that was suggested by, I believe it was Scotty Greenwood of the CABC that came up with this idea, that Canadians be first pre-screened by Canadian border officials on our side of the border, and on their first trip into the U.S., they would get their second interview to get the Nexus pass. So I think it's great to get this out of the way. It's a practical workaround, and I think we should be very grateful that has been resolved.
As you mentioned, overwhelming Canadians use Nexus. It's about 80% of the 1.7 million people who use it. So yes, indeed a big number. Let's talk about Haiti, of course. Biden's been pressuring Trudeau to sort of set up a Canadian-led international security force in Haiti. You talked about it a little bit, but I think one of the questions, particularly for Canadians and Ontarians, is what's in it for Canada, rather, politically speaking? Obviously a humanitarian crisis there, but what is it seen for as Canada on the global stage to be partaking in sort of this mission here?
Well, the fact is that Canada has been leading on Haiti for many, many years, but particularly so since the earthquake. We have been leaders in providing humanitarian support. And we also have led at the UN. It was Canada that has been for a very long time the chair of the task force, the UN task force. And we have advocated extremely strongly for the maintenance of the UN mission in Haiti. That did not come to pass in the end. The UN pulled out, and that was actually something that Canada very much regretted. But I think moving forward, as the U.S. asks us to lean even more into the Haiti, I think that we will have to consider whether whatever action are decided will actually have a chance of working. It's a very complex theater. It has, and we don't want to give up on Haiti by any stretch of the imagination, and the government is very concerned about it. But at the same time, we really have to make sure that whatever Canada decides to do on behalf of a coalition, that it has really a recipe for success. And I think that's what our government is considering at the moment.
Very good. I promised we would talk business, so let's do that. Leaders from business groups in all three countries, including the Business Council for Canada, had penned an open letter calling on the three amigos to enhance North American competitiveness. Let's read a quote from that letter. It reads, "Today we have an unprecedented opportunity to position North America as the world's leading producer of electric vehicles, also known as EVs, but we will only succeed if we work together to overcome shortages of key raw materials, encourage investment in new manufacturing capacity, and make it easier for consumers to purchase EVs." Now, I was, reading a lot about this, and there was one quote that stuck out in terms of when we look at all three of the nations involved here. U.S., they have the capital. When we look at Mexico, they have the resources. When we talk about labor, when we talk about on the Canadian front, we have, say, the natural resources. The Ontario government has heralded EVs as an important pillar for this province's economic future. And here in Canada, we, as we mentioned, have those critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, graphite, and nickel. What do we stand to gain from a trilateral partnership when we talk about EVs here?
Well, it's interesting. It's not surprising that automotive has been really at the center of our trade relations with United States and Mexico. It's at the center of CUSMA. And so as we transition towards green, we make the green transition, EV is at the center of that. So Canada very much, I think, is well positioned to ensure that we have a really good share of that pie, because I think the United States want to become the premier manufacturer of EV vehicles, and that includes batteries, which is, of course, the integral part of an EV vehicle. And when we succeeded last year to convince the Americans to carve in or carve out Canada into their tax credit scheme, that was a huge win that laid the groundwork to enable us not just to provide our critical minerals, but also interest European and Asian car manufacturers to open and establish plant manufacturing in Canada. So what you're seeing today is a lot of announcements coming out of Ontario, and while we focus on the big manufacturers, the assembly plants, there's a huge supply chain that feeds all of that, and it's everything from software to, as you said, the critical minerals. So everyone can gain, whether it's Quebec or other provinces that have capabilities. And a great example of that is Project Arrow, which is the APMA prototype of all Canadian made from bumper to bumper Canadian EV vehicle. So I think we're proving that we are at the table, and not just for raw materials, but actually for the technology and everything else that goes into the car. So the United States listened to us last year. I think we should be very happy about that. They sometimes tend to forget us from time to time. So this was a positive development, and this becomes a model for other sectors. I think if we can prove we can get this done with something as important as EV cars, then the sky's the limit for the rest.
All right, let's talk about another positive here. At least on paper, the three countries agreed to strengthen investment in the semiconductor supply chain, sort of to prevent an over-reliance on Asia. However, there was concerns about this Buy America provision. I want to get your take, how will Buy America provisions factor into the three countries' cooperation on this file?
We have, I think, we're getting to the beginning of this conversation with the Americans. It was great to see at the summit. You heard it from Secretary Blinken. You heard it from President Biden. This really North America approach to that sector, to the general securing of our supply chain issue. It was very enlightening to hear Secretary Raimondo also tell the business community that she feels that their CHIPS, so to say, act actually is going to rely as well on Canada and Mexico to provide the components that they need. So her message was, look, yes, these are incentives that will attract investment in the United States, but that investment will lead to supply chains that will be beneficial to both countries. So that's the message. And so, but I don't think we can take that for granted as Canada. I think we have to keep pushing. You heard that the French had a message or two to President Emmanuel Macron when he was in Washington not too long ago, expressed a great deal of frustration to the Americans with these protectionist policies. And we'll have to wait and see what Europe's able to get out of this. But I think that we have succeeded at convincing the Americans that first they should look to their own continental partners. But we'll have to continue to push that.
All right, Canada and the U.S., this was another one talking about energy, are sort of in a dispute with Mexican President Obrador about sort of his preferential treatment of Mexico's state oil company and national power utility. Is Mexico discriminating Canada and American investors for setting up shop in Mexico?
Look, we think they are. We have requested through USMCA. We've invoked the dispute mechanism on the energy issue. It was raised at the summit, and you heard the Mexican president reply that, look, send me your companies. I'm willing to speak with them. He's showing some willingness, I think, to examine the issue. We'll have to continue to work on this, and I'm hoping that we can avoid a full-on panel. But what I can say is there are examples of Canadian companies in the energy sectors being extremely successful in Mexico today, like TC Energy, for example, that just received approval for a major pipeline project. It's a natural gas pipeline that will actually bring greener, cheaper energy to more poorer areas of Mexico, so which is near and dear to the heart of the president. And he cites that as a success story. So I think we can build on that. We can show that we can be a partner in helping Mexico achieve its own objectives. And it's interesting to note that that pipeline will actually also allow Mexico to export its natural gas in Central America. So I think we have to continue to have a dialogue, and hopefully we can bring in even more Canadian investment in the country, and have more of a continental approach to energy security, which is so important.
All right, I want to stick with our sort of relationship with Canada and Mexico. We have a few minutes left. In your op-ed, you had written for the Globe and Mail that Canada and Mexico have not actually sought close strategic ties yet. Canada historically has sort of resisted trilateralism and has preferred making separate deals with the U.S. It's sort of hard to ignore the U.S. when they're, smack dab in the middle, but also one of the biggest competitions and competitors there. Why is it important that we sort of break away from this pattern?
And I will say right off the start that I fallen prey to that vision as well, having served in the U.S. It's easy for us as Canadians to really focus exclusively on the United States, and we've always we tend to see Mexico as a trilateral trade partner with that continental trade agreement, but at the same time, I think that given the fact that there's only 3 of us on this continent, the world is getting more and more uncertain. And I think that we cannot afford to have uncertainty in our own neighborhood. And that means building trust, building relationships, and learning to work together in a wider framework with the Mexicans. So I think that if we strengthen that pillar, that bilateral relationship with Mexico, we will make our relationship with the United States that much more balanced and more successful. I'm not talking here about ganging up, against the Americans. That's never a good strategy. But at the same time, I think the United States has a lot to gain by Canada and Mexico having a close relationship. And so I'm encouraging a closer academic ties, the sorts that we have with Europe, for example, with student exchanges, academic exchanges, as well as cultural people-to-people ties. Look, I've just been spending a lot of time in Mexico City, and I'm struck that as Canadians, we tend to think of Mexico as, beaches and palm trees. But there's a vibrancy and there is a sophistication to the Mexican culture that somehow many of us have failed to fully appreciate. And while, yes, the security concerns are real, they are not the end all and be all of Mexico as a country. And I certainly think that if we were to have greater contacts, know each other better, I think we would be able to work more closely together. And I'll just close by just saying that one of the manifestation of that is working together in multilateral arenas. We don't really at the moment. When Canada considers a position at the UN, whether it's in New York or Geneva, we call our friends in Europe and of course the Americans, but we should also be calling Mexico and say, hey, what do you think about this? And then also hearing from them, what are you hearing in your, and with your allies in Central and Latin America, and how could we work together to achieve certain things? So that's what I'm encouraging, and I really do believe that this is, given the global context of today, this is the way to go for Canada.
Really great stuff, Louise. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Of course, something that we will continue to follow over the course of the next couple months and years.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.